So we're slowly getting closer to the release of 007 First Light. The game is set to launch on May 27, 2026 across PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S, and PC, with the Nintendo Switch version coming later this summer, which already tells you about how they're thinking about rollout and reach. A really staggered release instead of just everything at once. It was originally planned for March, but it got pushed back by about 2 months, and honestly, that delay is probably one of the more important signals here. Because in most cases, when a game gets delayed that close to release, it's not just about adding new features, it's more about polishing what's already there, and that becomes relevant when you look at who makes this game. IO Interactive isn't just any studio, they've spent the last decade refining a very specific kind of design philosophy through the Hitman games, and one that's built around player freedom, systems interacting with one another, and letting situations unfold in different ways depending on how you approach them. And if you look at First Light, it doesn't feel like they're moving away from that. It feels like they're translating it or reconfiguring it to fit this new game. And that becomes especially clear in the newly released video that I want to go through called Rules of Spycraft, which was just revealed as of late. On the surface, it plays very much like a cinematic introduction, especially in their statement, "Welcome to MI6, and here's how to survive as a double O agent." Underneath that, it's doing something more deliberate. It's outlining the core systems of the game, just framed as narrative. It starts with blending in, and from here, everything builds outward, moving through crowds, paying attention to conversations, using the environment. It's less about pushing forward and more about navigating that area where you find yourself in. And that's where the core IO interactive DNA really comes through. Because instead of guiding you through a fixed path, the game seems to be structured around multiple entry points, different ways of approaching the same situation. In a way, it reflects what in design theory is often described as the exploration versus exploitation. You're not just executing a predefined solution, you're exploring the environment, testing options, adapting your approach. You're searching your surroundings for things that you yourself are capable of. And as a double O agent, you've got the leeway to do so. You have your gadgets depending on how far you've gotten at any point, and you can use them how you see fit to solve the mission. That's very different from more linear action games. And then there's the bluffing aspect, which adds another layer to that system. It's not just about staying hidden, it's about managing how you're perceived. You can recover from mistakes, move through spaces where you don't belong, but it's limited. It depends on your instinct and it becomes less effective against more experienced enemies. So it introduces limitations and you need to be very aware of that. You can't just bluff your way through the entire game. There are certain situations that calls for bluffing, but there's definitely situations where your bluffing will do nothing. And that's very important because in game design and more broadly in innovation, constraints are often what creates meaningful decisions. Without them, systems really just becomes trivial. It's not something to just haphazardly apply anywhere, and in that particular case, it makes it become even more meaningful. But from there, the focus shifts into preparation, and this is where the Bond identity becomes much more explicit. You return to MI6 between missions, not just as a menu, but as a physical hub you can explore. You gather intel, you interact with characters, and then move into the Q lab. And the gadgets follow the same logic as everything else. They're not there to solve problems directly, they're there to expand your options, such as the Q lens, where this gadget in particular can highlight opportunities in the environment. Other gadgets, such as the Q watch, let you interact with them, creating distractions, disabling systems, shaping the situation before it escalates. And there do exist some even more direct tools like smoke, darts, or stun devices. These gadgets or weapons in particular, they don't push you into combat. They, in a way, reinforce control over the situation. And that's a consistent pattern throughout everything we've seen so far. But of course, things don't always go according to plan, and that's where the improvisation comes in. The environment itself becomes part of your toolkit. Objects, surfaces, anything around you can be used if you need to adapt quickly. And if things escalate further, that's where the traditional action element appears. There's weapons, combats, direct confrontations, but even there, it can still feel secondary. Like the game is built around flexibility, not committing you to one particular playstyle, but instead letting you shift between them depending on the situation. They also introduce something called focus, slowing down time, increasing precision, giving you more control in high pressure moments. And then there's the tag sim, which is interesting. It extends the experience beyond the main story. It's essentially a training system, different challenges, different rules, and performance comparisons against other players. You earn experience, you unlock upgrades, weapons, outfits, and importantly, they already confirmed that this will continue to expand at launch, which ties into something broader. Because at IO Interactive, they've been very clear before launch is just the starting point. And from an innovation perspective, that's a shift toward what you would call a more iterative development model. Instead of delivering a finished product and moving on, they're building something that evolves over time instead. And stepping away from the video in question for a second, there's a few things we already know about the game that aren't really covered in there, but help complete the picture. First, this is a fully single-player, third-person action-adventure game. There's no indication of multiplayer or live service elements, which already lines up pretty well with how everything in the video is structured. It's built around control, decision making, and how you approach each situation on your own terms. The story is also completely original. You're playing a younger version of James Bond in his early career, not tied to the films, but more of a fresh take on the character. And that gives them a bit more freedom in how they build the world and the narrative around him. We also know the game is being built on IO Interactive's Glacier engine, the same one used in the Hitman series, which makes a lot more sense considering how system-driven everything looks. That engine is specifically designed to handle complex interactions, AI behavior, and layered environments, which is exactly this kind of gameplay depends on. Beyond the individual systems, the structure of the game itself is just as important. This isn't a retelling of the films, but an original origin story. You're playing a younger James Bond, around 26 years old, I do believe. They mentioned that earlier in his career as he enters the Double O program, and that alone gives the developers more freedom since they're not tied to existing storylines. But at the same time, the game seems to combine two approaches that don't always fit easily together. On one hand, you have the Hitman style design, open-ended missions, player-driven solutions, and a stronger focus on freedom. On the other, there are more traditional cinematic elements layered in, car chases, scripted sequences, and high-stakes moments that feel closer to something like the Uncharted series. So it's not purely open-ended, but not fully linear either. And that balance is likely one of the core challenges, because leaning too far towards structure can limit player freedom, while too much freedom can weaken pacing and the narrative impact. And bringing those two together in a way that feels cohesive is not straightforward. And when you look at the overall scope of the project, the challenge becomes even more apparent. This is being positioned as IO Interactive's most ambitious game so far, combining stealth, social systems, gadgets, progression, and cinematic storytelling within a single experience. And that's where the interesting question is, not whether the game will work, but whether all of these elements can actually come together in a way that feels coherent. Because if they do, it could end up being something quite different from what people expect from a Bond game. And if they don't, it risks feeling like a mix of good ideas that never fully aligns. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I am very much looking forward to seeing how this game progresses, what else could be revealed about the game, and yeah, that's gonna do it all for me. Take care, everyone.